Hi there, it's time for another one of my gaming memories videos, and in this one I'm going to be taking a look at the granddaddy of video game consoles and also the first big commercial success as far as consoles were concerned. It's the Atari 2600. Now this was released in the late 70s, so I'm a little bit too young to have played one first time around, although I think I did have a friend who had one. So my history of the Atari 2600 began in the mid 2000s when I bought one from eBay. At that point you could get them for like £10 to £15 for a complete console unboxed, and you could pick up the games for like £3 or £4 at most. So it's a good system to collect for, and I managed to put myself together a pretty decent selection of most of the major games, which I've topped up over the years. And what I found is that most of the Atari 2600 games that I really like tend to be from third-party publishers. That's a concept that was brand new on the Atari 2600, as before that all the games tended to be published by the same company that actually produced the hardware. So you can't really talk about third-party publishers without mentioning Activision, the original third-party publisher, formed by a number of disgruntled Atari programmers who felt they weren't getting the credit they deserved. They produced some of the most innovative and technically impressive games for the Atari 2600, and it should come as no surprise that most of this list is going to consist of Activision games. So that was the background behind my thinking for this video. What I did was go through my Atari 2600 collection, play through all my third-party games and come up with this list of 10 favourites. They may not necessarily be the best, but they're the ones I like the most, and I'm sure if you've got any thoughts about whether things should be higher or lower in the list or anything I've missed, then you'll let me know in the comments. So without further ado, let's get on with the countdown. Kicking off this list in 10th place is Chopper Command, released in 1982 by Activision and programmed by Bob Whitehead. In this game, the player flies a helicopter over a horizontal wraparound landscape that scrolls left or right depending on the direction the player travels. You must protect a convoy of trucks from enemy fighter jets and helicopters that attack both them and your chopper. A long-range scanner displayed at the bottom of the screen shows all enemies, including those not visible on the main screen. Your helicopter is destroyed if it collides with an enemy aircraft, a truck, or if it's hit by an enemy bullet. The enemy bullet is split in two once fired, with one going up and the other down. Each enemy helicopter is worth 100 points, each jet's worth 200, and all enemies on a level must be destroyed in order to complete it. After each wave, bonus points are awarded for any remaining trucks. Chopper Command is one of many Atari games inspired by Defender, and the first of 3 on this list alone. The two-directional player-controlled scrolling, radar, and aim of eliminating all the enemies to complete a stage comes straight from the Williams arcade game, though in this case they're used in a more real-world military setting. As an early Activision release, the game has simple blocky graphics with no detail on the player or enemy sprites. It also has a very brown background, though there's a nice sunset effect behind the hills that would be seen in many other Activision games too. The scrolling is nice and smooth, and some of the sound effects are good, such as the sound of the helicopter blades and the explosions, but the sound of the player's laser gets annoying and doesn't really fit the theme of the game. The radar view is excellent and very precise, and it can be used to line up with enemies before they come on screen, so it's easier to blast them before they hit you. You could in fact almost play the game just using the radar if it weren't for stray enemy shots. Like all Activision games for the Atari, you could earn a patch by taking a photo when you reached a certain score or achievement in the game. In this case, a score of 10,000 points would earn you a Chopper Commandos patch. That seems like a pretty low score threshold compared to a lot of their games, but that is misleading as this game is pretty tough. You can easily get killed by random splitting bullets or an erratic jet crashing into you, and getting past level 3 or 4 is a stiff challenge. This was one of the first games I put some decent time into when I got an Atari 2600 in the late 2000s, and when I finally reached 10,000 points I actually bought myself the patch from eBay and sewed it onto an Atari t-shirt that I had. Chopper Command's a polished game, but it can be very frustrating, and playing it again for this video it wasn't quite as much fun as I remembered. Having said that, it's still worth a spot on this list, albeit at the bottom. In 9th place is Dragonfire. This was released in 1982 and published by Imagic and written by Bob Smith. This is a fantasy themed action game where the player must grab treasure from a castle guarded by a dragon whilst avoiding fireballs. Each level of Dragonfire has 2 stages. The first is a side view of the character trying to cross a bridge to reach the castle. Fireballs are fired across the bridge intermittently and the player must duck under or jump over them as they make their way to the castle door. Upon reaching the castle, the second stage begins, which has a more top-down point of view. The player guides the character around a room collecting treasure and dodging the fireballs spewed by a dragon that moves across the bottom of the screen. Collecting every piece of treasure will open an exit door, which the player must reach to complete the level. The 2-stage sequence then repeats, with the character, dragon and fireballs getting progressively faster in each iteration. This is another game I played quite a bit when I first picked up an Atari. It's a pretty simple idea for a game, but it's quite hard to master as the difficulty level ramps up quite quickly, with the dragon's fireballs homing in on you rapidly after the first 2 levels. There's some variety with 2 nice stages that both have good graphics and sound for a 1982 game, and the animation on the main player sprite is well done. The controls take a few goes to get used to, and you'll need quick reactions and a responsive joystick to get through both stages. By the standards of later Atari games, it is quite repetitive, but the fantasy theme was reasonably unique for the time. It definitely has an addictive one more go factor and offers a good high score challenge. At number 8 is Frostbite, another Activision game that was developed by Steve Cartwright and released in 1983. Set in an Arctic environment, the aim of the game is to help Frostbite Bailey build igloos by jumping on the ice floes. Attempting to stop you are snow geese, Alaskan king crabs, clams and polar bears, and you must also complete your igloo before the temperature drops too low. The bottom 2/3 of the play area consists of water with 4 rows of ice blocks floating horizontally. The player moves by jumping from one row to another while avoiding enemies, and landing on a row of white ice changes it to blue and adds a piece to the igloo on the shore. When all the ice has been turned blue, it reverts back to white and the process begins again until the igloo is complete. The direction ice is flowing can be changed by pressing the joystick button, but it costs a piece of the incomplete igloo. On some stages, fish can be collected for bonus points. When the igloo is complete, the player must enter it to end the level and will receive bonus points depending on how quickly it was completed. The next level then begins with a higher difficulty level, which may mean smaller blocks of ice to jump on or more dangerous enemies, including a polar bear that patrols the shore on later stages. Frostbite clearly takes influences from both Frogger and Q*bert, but the aim of the game is still original. The graphics are nicely defined and quite cute. I especially like the little crabs and clams bobbing in the water. The sounds are unfortunately pretty basic and do let the game down compared to the way it looks. Everything moves smoothly and the controls are responsive and include the ability to jump diagonally, which you'll need as the ice flows move faster as levels progress. The gameplay is fast-paced arcade-style action with lots of hazards to avoid and rewards for completing levels as quickly as possible. It does have quite a steep difficulty curve compared to many of Activision's games, and that could be off-putting for a lot of players. However, if you stick with it then it's a fun and addictive game with the new twist on old ideas that many of Activision's games were known for. In 7th place is Subterranea, released in 1983 by Imagic and programmed by Mark D. Klein. Subterranea is a horizontally scrolling shooter with free movement left or right, similar to Defender. Controlling a spacecraft, your goal is to locate treasure crystals within the Hexaplex caves. The gameplay is broken into 2 types of stage. The first stage of each level is a single screen battle between your ship and enemies that are generated from a creature at the bottom of the screen, which try and home in on you. When all of the enemies have been destroyed, you collect a crystal which opens a passageway at the bottom of the screen, allowing you to travel deeper into the cavern. The following stages are then all horizontally scrolling, where once again you must destroy a specific number of aliens to open up an exit to the next cave. You must then pass through an electro gate that fires impenetrable beams in a pattern. You get 3 attempts to get through, after which if you fail you're forced to repeat the current stage without scoring any points. After progressing through several scrolling stages you'll complete the level and return to the single screen stage with an increase in difficulty. You're rewarded extra lives not by score but by completing stages without being hit. Imagic's take on a Defender style game has a mixture of different levels which mostly involve lots of shooting, but some variation is added with the need to carefully get through the gates to the next stage, which needs some precise timing or pixel perfect positioning of your craft. It has simple but varied sprites with some nicely designed enemies, but the main ship is quite bland. The scenery is pretty minimal, but the scrolling is good and your ship has some inertia, which comes in handy as the trick to getting through the stage is to fly past enemies, then get behind them and chase them to stop them firing at you. As you'd expect, the levels get increasingly more difficult with faster moving and more evasive enemies, and they start to fire at you from wave 2 onwards. The sequence of beams on the gates also gets harder to learn the further you progress. Subterranea isn't doing anything especially new, but it's a well programmed and addictive high score challenge that needs both skill and fast reactions to get to higher levels. At number 6 is Robot Tank, another Activision game released in 1983, this one written by Alan Miller. This is the first person shoot 'em up that's similar in design to Atari's Battlezone and especially its 2600 port. The player controls a tank in 2019 using radar to find and destroy enemy tanks intent on reaching downtown Santa Clara, California. The enemy is organised into squadrons of 12 tanks each, and eliminating an entire squadron adds a reserve tank to your initial 3. Combat can take place at any time of day or night and a clock is displayed on screen, while weather conditions announced at the start of each level can also have an impact. Rain slows the tank's movement, snow causes loss of traction and fog impairs visibility. When the player's tank is hit by enemy fire, firepower movement or visual display capabilities can be irreparably damaged. This damage is indicated on the status bar at the bottom of the screen. Enough damage will eventually destroy your tank and the game ends when all your reserve tanks have been destroyed. This is a very impressive game from a technical perspective with smooth scrolling and movement in a pseudo 3D environment. The weather effects and day-night cycle are really well implemented and make use of the sunset effect that I mentioned earlier when talking about Chopper Command. I would say though that the day-night cycle is really quick and given the game is supposed to be set in California, it's odd that it goes dark at 5 PM. This means that you don't get much time to try and get to grips with the game before the extra difficulty of playing in darkness is thrown at you. It's easy to target enemies to begin with and you have the advantage of being able to move shots after firing to home in on targets. I'm not sure that's very realistic, but it is satisfying. The controls are good and the radar and damage indicators are implemented well, while the scrambled screen effect when you lose a tank is brilliantly done and adds to the immersive feel of the game. The difficulty curve is quite steep after the first day, with the increased fire rate of enemy tanks and the weather effects playing a part, affecting visibility or movement. That makes the game tough, but it's also addictive as you always feel you can do a bit better next time around. Overall, Robot Tank has a bit of a naff name, but is technically very impressive and much more playable than Battlezone in my view. I've reached the halfway point of this list now then, and in 5th place is Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back, released in 1982 by Parker Brothers and developed by Rex Bradford. The Empire Strikes Back is another Defender-inspired scrolling shooter and has the distinction of being the first licensed Star Wars video game. The player controls Luke Skywalker in his snowspeeder in the Battle of Hoth, recreating the sequence from the start of the movie. The objective is to hold off the Imperial attack walkers for as long as possible before they destroy the power generator at the Rebel base. A walker can be destroyed by shooting it repeatedly in the head or torso. Shots to the legs are ineffective. As the walker is damaged, it changes colour, transitioning from black through various shades of grey, red and orange to yellow, which means it's critically damaged. The player can also destroy walkers by shooting a small flashing spot that randomly appears on them from time to time. The approaching walkers are depicted on a simple radar view at the bottom of the screen, and when the lead one is destroyed, another will appear at the far end. The walkers shoot back at the player, whose speeder also changes colour as it's damaged, but a damaged speeder can be repaired by landing it on the ground. While there are no power-ups in the game, occasionally you'll be granted the power of the Force, making you invincible for a short time. When this happens, the speeder flashes colourfully. As the game progresses, the walkers move more rapidly, increasing the difficulty level. The game ends when all the player's speeders are destroyed, or when the lead walker reaches Echo Base on the right-hand side of the play area, destroying it. The game features a number of difficulty modes with varying effects. On some levels the walkers are solid, meaning the player can crash into them. Other levels include a smart bomb which periodically launches from a flashing port on a walker and follows the player, destroying them if it makes contact. This is the third and final Defender-influenced game on my list, and it has all the characteristics you'd expect, with multi-directional scrolling, acceleration, inertia and a radar, though the latter doesn't really serve much purpose in this one. It's got the classic Atari chunky single colour sprites, but they are reasonable representations of the snowspeeder and AT-ATs, though the animation of the walker's legs is quite comically bad. The scrolling's smooth even when moving at high speed, and there's a decent parallax effect for the time. The backgrounds are somewhat garish for the planet of Hoth, but do allow everything to stand out better, and if you want a more authentic palette you can switch the game to black and white mode. This game may seem quite simple to begin with, but it actually has quite a bit of depth for a 1982 release. There are lots of game modes that give different challenges, and elements like being able to repair your speeder by landing and hitting the sweet spot on the walkers to destroy them are innovative touches for the time. You could rightly argue that the game is repetitive and endless, so could get boring, but it's still a playable recreation of the classic action sequence from the film. If you're any good at it, you'll undoubtedly get hand ache from all the firing and manoeuvring though. At number 4 is River Raid, released in 1982 by Activision. This was programmed by H.E.R.O, who was something of a pioneer of female game developers at that time. The game was one of Activision's most popular early releases and over 1 million cartridges were sold. Viewed from a top-down perspective, the player flies a fighter jet over the River of No Return in a raid behind enemy lines. The jet can only move left and right, it can't manoeuvre up and down the screen, but it can accelerate and decelerate. The jet crashes if it collides with a riverbank or an enemy vehicle, or if it runs out of fuel. The player scores points for shooting enemy tankers, helicopters, fuel depots, jets and bridges. the jet can also be refueled by flying over a fuel depot. A bridge marks the end of the game level and also serves as a checkpoint. If the player crashes, they'll start with their next jet at the last destroyed bridge. River Raid is one of the all-time classics for the Atari 2600. It's got simple but well-defined graphics with plenty of colour, and the scrolling is smooth just as it is with most Atari games. It may be a primitive console, but whoever developed the scrolling capability certainly seemed to know what they were doing. The sound consists of simple jet noises, shots and explosions, but all fit the game well. The gameplay is simple but addictive and is great for a high score challenge with a fair difficulty curve, each level being slightly more challenging than the last. There's not a huge variety of enemies, but the landscape becomes more hazardous as you progress, and the ability to speed up or slow down comes into effect more as you have to avoid moving obstacles or make tighter movements to avoid crashing. Having to keep your fuel topped up is another thing to think about, and one of my favourite aspects is the choice to either collect or shoot a fuel dump, or even do both if you time it right. This game is of course basic compared to later shooters, but it remains very playable and was undoubtedly influential on the vertically scrolling shoot 'em up genre. The Activision love continues from this point on, and in third place is Pressure Cooker. This was released in 1983 by Activision and coded by the appropriately named Gary Kitchen. In Pressure Cooker you take on the role of a cook who must assemble and package hamburgers to order without letting the ingredients or burgers fall to the floor. The play area consists of 2 rooms. In the assembly room the player must collect the right ingredients and assemble the burgers. Hamburgers go through an oven and are placed on a conveyor belt that moves steadily down the left hand side of the screen. The customer orders are displayed on a chart at the bottom of the screen, and in order to fulfill them the player must catch the toppings that fly out of the dispensers on the right hand side. The toppings must then be placed on the burger. If an ingredient isn't currently required, it can be sent back to the dispenser by pressing the fire button when it makes contact with the chef. Once the burger is assembled, the player must catch the top bun, place it on the burger and then enter the wrapping room. The completed order must then be dropped into the corresponding coloured slot. You begin the game with 50 performance points, which can be lost when making mistakes such as dropping or wasting ingredients, dropping the burger into the wrong coloured slot, or allowing a burger to fall off the conveyor belt. Losing all your performance points ends the game. Once all the orders have been fulfilled, the level ends and the player receives bonus points for remaining performance points and for every burger successfully completed. If you thought the Atari was only capable of simple shooting or sports games, then Pressure Cooker will make you think again. This is a really imaginative and innovative game, mixing arcade action with mild puzzle and strategy elements, and even throwing in a bit of resource management. It's got lovely detailed graphics, especially for the main player sprite, and lots of colour, which is actually an important factor in the game. Sound-wise it's brilliant too, with good sound effects, jingles to start and end the game, and even in-game music, which can be toggled on or off using one of the difficulty switches. Nobody would have ever seen this kind of game before back in 1983, so because of that it's got a perfect difficulty curve, starting off easy by just having 1 ingredient per order, and then adding more complex orders and speeding up as the levels progress. Eventually you end up with lots to manage and remember as the more complex orders stack up, which is what makes the game's name Pressure Cooker so absolutely fitting. It can sometimes be annoying when you accidentally collect an item you don't want, or it crashes into you due to you being positioned a few pixels off, both of which will end up losing your performance points. This is an 80s game though, so you can't expect it to be too easy, can you? That's really the only niggle in what is a really clever and playable game, and one that you really should play if you want to see the origins of popular modern games such as Overcooked. Coming in at second place is Pitfall 2 Lost Caverns, released in 1984 by Activision and designed and programmed by David Crane, who was responsible for the original Pitfall. I'm sure you're already fully aware of this, but Pitfall 2 is a platform game that dramatically expands the scope of the original game as Pitfall Harry descends into a deep vertically scrolling underground environment. Unlike the first game, Harry has unlimited time and lives, making it impossible to lose the game. If Harry touches a dangerous creature, he loses points as he moves back to the last continue point he passed, marked with a red cross. The aim of the game is to collect all the treasure, including a diamond ring, and also locate Quick Claw, Harry's cowardly pet mountain lion, and Rhonda, his adventure-seeking niece. There are numerous creatures to avoid, including scorpions, bats and electric eels, as well as natural hazards such as rivers and chasms. In another advancement on the first game, Harry can ascend to new areas by grabbing hold of balloons. Pitfall 2 is one of the last major releases for the Atari 2600 and one of the most technically advanced. The cartridge contains a custom display processor chip designed by Crane for improved visuals and 4-channel music.
No Atari 2600 top 10 list would be complete without a Pitfall game, and while I know lots of people love the original, I find that quite frustrating and don't think it's aged especially well. Pitfall 2 on the other hand is a huge improvement that takes away many of the annoyances of the first game, though you still need pixel perfect jumping and manoeuvring at times. Thanks to David Crane's mastery of the hardware and that custom chip, this is a masterpiece of Atari programming, with a huge environment to explore, colourful and well animated sprites, wave effects on the water, balloons that you can grab onto and control the speed of, catchy sound effects and not one but two pieces of music. As well as being technically impressive, the game was also responsible for introducing several concepts that would become hallmarks in adventure platform games, such as open exploration, checkpoints and the inability to die. In essence, it's still a collect 'em up high score challenge game, but the freedom to explore makes it much more than that. If you want to explore and complete the game at a leisurely pace, then you can, but if you want a perfect run, you'll need to work out strategies and have precise timing to get past the different types of enemy. Mapping out the caverns is also essential to making effective progress, as it's easy to get lost and end up backtracking. It can be frustrating getting sent back a long way to a checkpoint after being hit by an enemy, but never so much that it stops you trying again. You always feel it was your own fault for making a mistake, so it's fair. Pitfall 2 is a game I've never completed due to the very challenging later section, but it's always fun to play and you can easily lose an hour exploring the lost caverns. Hopefully one day I'll have the time and expertise to conquer the game, but until then I'll always enjoy trying. As I've just been saying, Pitfall 2 is the Atari 2600's killer app, and from a technical standpoint it's unmatched, but for me there's one third party game that surpasses it for playability, and that game is my number one, H.E.R.O, Helicopter Emergency Rescue Operation to give it its full title. That was released in 1984 by Activision. It was written by John Van Ryzen. The player assumes control of Roderick H.E.R.O, a one-man rescue team who must reach trapped miners in an ever more dangerous series of shafts made up of multiple screens. Roderick is equipped with a backpack-mounted helicopter unit along with a helmet-mounted laser and a limited supply of dynamite. The backpack has a finite amount of power, so the player must reach the miner before the power supply is exhausted. If the power runs out, then the player restarts the level from the beginning. The mine shafts may be blocked by cave-ins or magma, which require dynamite to clear, though the helmet laser can also destroy cave-ins. Magma is lethal when touched. The mine is populated by spiders, bats and other creatures that are also deadly to the touch. These can be destroyed using the laser or dynamite. Some mine sections are illuminated by lanterns, and if these are somehow destroyed, the layout of that section becomes invisible, though exploding dynamite will light up the mine for a brief time. On later levels, some mines are flooded, forcing players to hover above the water, and monsters can sometimes attack from below the surface. Points are scored for clearing cave-ins and killing creatures, and when the player reaches the miner, points are also awarded for the rescue, along with the amount of power remaining and for each unused stick of dynamite. I'm actually more familiar with the Commodore 64 version of H.E.R.O, which was one of the first games I ever played on the system in the mid-80s, and is one I reviewed as part of my Silverbird selection series a couple of years back. That version does have slightly enhanced graphics compared to the Atari one, but gameplay-wise they're identical and equally as good. The graphics in this version may be simpler, but they're still really good for this system, with everything well drawn, and it's clear what everything is and does. The sound effects are also great, with the noise of the helicopter blades, lasers and explosions all spot on. What I really love about this game is that it has a brilliant difficulty curve. Every level gets a little bit bigger and harder than the previous one, introducing new hazards and problems slowly, so you really feel like you're making progress with each new stage. To begin with, you may lose a life in a stupid way, but you probably won't make that mistake again, so you tend to get further every game as long as you remember what's coming, which gives it that addictive one more go factor. As you get deeper into the game, you'll learn that there are multiple paths through some stages and that sometimes you'll need to be clever about when to use dynamite, occasionally having to resort to the slower method of shooting the barriers instead, which is also potentially a way of earning more points if you reach the end of the level. Later stages also include areas where you have to hover over water, which is quite hard to master, so you also have to learn new skills as you progress as well as dealing with new hazards. In essence, H.E.R.O is a pretty simple maze game, but it's implemented so well that it makes it a joy to play, and it encourages a more thoughtful type of gameplay than the many shooters on the system. This helps it stand out from the crowd, whilst it still offers a typical high score challenge that almost all Atari games do. As you'll have worked out from this list, Activision were the masters of original, innovative and technically accomplished games on the Atari 2600, which is what made them not only the first but the greatest third-party publisher on the system, and makes H.E.R.O the best of the third-party games I've played. So there you have it, that brings my countdown of the top 10 third-party Atari 2600 games to an end. I think the 2600 is an often overlooked system, with many retro gamers avoiding it due to the perception that it's very primitive. Hopefully this list has shown you that there's some very clever and interesting games on the Atari, and if this video has made you consider giving the system a try for the first time, then leave a comment and let me know which games took your fancy. If you have played these games before and have a favourite, or know of any great third-party games that I might have missed, then again, please leave a comment. I hope you enjoyed this countdown, and if this is your first time watching one of my videos, then please check out my other stuff and consider subscribing for regular retro gaming content. Thanks very much for watching, and until the next time, see ya!